And thanks so much for joining us for Detroit Public Television's coverage of the 2019 Mackinac Policy Conference. I'm Christy McDonald, and for the next 3 days, we'll be here in the beautiful parlor of the Grand Hotel with 1,600 business leaders, educators, foundation heads, and politicians from around Michigan. They're all here on Mackinac Island to tackle a lot of the big issues facing our state, and the agenda is packed with sessions and speakers focusing on creating a competitive Michigan, workforce development, the future of mobility, politics, of course, and restoring confidence and trust in government, media, and business. This is Detroit Public Television's 9th year partnering with the Detroit Regional Chamber to provide an all-access pass to the rest of the state for the conference, and we'll be streaming all of the sessions and interviews live right here. You'll be able to see them on demand at DetroitPBS.org. Plus, we'll have nightly shows from the island. You can check it out at 7:30 p.m. on Detroit Public TV. And also make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Tell us what you think of the conference, the speakers, and what's on your mind. So let's go ahead and take a look at where Michigan stands right now in May 2019. In 2019, Michigan finds itself with a new governor and new leadership in Lansing, already at odds over the big issues like auto insurance, the budget, and fixing the roads.
Our leaders have failed us. They have pretended that we could get by, or we could get by on small fixes. And now we've got a crisis on our hands, a crisis that we're all paying for already.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer ran on a Fix the Damn Roads platform and is pushing for a gas tax to raise the over $2 billion needed to get Michigan's infrastructure back up to par. But it's a tax the Republican-led House and Senate don't seem to want to buy into. There are also stark differences on how much to spend on K-12 education. The state now has a new superintendent, and schools are getting ready to implement the third grade reading law, which calls for kids to be held back if they're not reading at grade level. Given that only half of Michigan's third graders were proficient or advanced on state tests last year, retention of large numbers of kids is a real concern. There is also focus on Detroit schools, 2 years on the job for Superintendent Nikolai Vitti.
I think at the end of this year, we're going to see improvement with the percentage of students that are performing at or above grade level.
Education is emerging as a key factor in training Michigan's workforce for the future, as well as attracting businesses with high-level jobs and salaries that go with them.
There is a growing optimism around, the trajectory of Michigan, and there's a lot to be optimistic about. And we see that in business investment. We see that in the success of our nonprofit institutions across the state. We see it a lot around kind of next generation mobility. We see it around technology. So we see a lot of positive things that are happening.
CEOs across the state are still looking for talent, and there is a concerted push to bring more people to the state and retain those new college grads.
We just have a stagnant population. So in our view, we think one of the biggest things we've got to focus on is population growth. And until we really get that going, it's going to continue to be a talent shortage here in our state.
The biggest city in the state, Detroit, continues to tout downtown growth. Major investment from FCA and Waymo announced this year. More hotel openings, housing options, but the push for neighborhood investment intensifies. Mayor Mike Duggan is putting focus and resource in certain neighborhoods, like here in Fitzgerald, for housing and stability. But still areas struggle with blighted properties and crime.
This house that's all, look, like you could almost blow it down.
In the city and around the state, environmental concerns, clean water, PFAS contamination are issues for not only local municipalities, but being fought at the national level by Michigan's congressional delegation. And speaking of politics, the 2020 election isn't that far away. Presidential candidates are already eyeing Michigan as a big-time battleground state. All right, and of course, here to help me cover the Mackinac Policy Conference, I couldn't do it without them, my colleagues Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of WDET and American Black Journal. Hi, guys. I put the martini glasses behind you just early on in the day.
Very early for that
kind of time to start filling them.
One correction I wanted to make in the story that just ran before you is we talked about they were getting close on auto insurance deal. They actually made that deal, which I think is really encouraging.
She's going to sign it up here, which I think goes a long way to her putting her stamp and kind of imprimatur on this conference the way that she needs to. This is a premier stage for whoever is governor, especially in the first year of governing, to be able to sign the first significant auto insurance legislation since 1973 up here. That gives her an enormous amount of momentum, I think, to deal with some of these other things on her agenda.
Yeah, because what's also on her agenda is roads and gas tax.
Yeah, and I expect that won't be as easy. I mean, no fault had been in the works for a long time. You got that last minute push from Dan Gilbert, who said, if you don't do it, I will. I think that sort of
Made everything come together a little
Yeah, I
quicker.
mean, it took away some of the conditions. She had wanted to tie bar it to the budget and a gas tax hike. I think that took that off the table. Other than that, I think they were pretty close on what they wanted out of this bill. And I do hope it delivers the relief that folks say it'll deliver, because these insurance rates in Michigan are outrageous.
What's the mood so far that you guys have picked up on? I always love sitting here because we're able to see people come and go and have those interesting side conversations that I always wish I could eavesdrop on.
Got a lot of conversation up here about Dan Gilbert. And, you know, of course, he's had a stroke. He's had a heart attack. We don't really know what his health is, but there's a lot of what ifs going on. What happens to Detroit without a Dan Gilbert? So it's focused a lot of conversation on his role, his influence.
And in the projects that he chooses to champion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go back 10 years in Detroit to 2009, which is right before his announcement that he was going to move Quicken downtown Detroit. I lived in downtown Detroit at that point, and I can tell you that it was like another planet compared to what's going on now. I wrote a column in 2009 about not being able to tell someone visiting from Chicago for a Bears game where to get a cup of coffee before the football game on a Sunday, because there just wasn't any place to really do that around the stadium. Right. Now you cannot turn around in downtown Detroit without bumping into opportunities to do all kinds of things. And so whether you like Dan Gilbert or not, whether you think what he's doing is monopolistic or not, those are all conversations we should have. But there is no way to deny the influence that this one person has had on the core part of the city.
And
it is all about his investment.
Future influence too.
100 buildings he's rehabbed. Before he started, there were 60, 70 buildings in downtown, the central city, that were empty and abandoned.
Yes, skyscrapers.
Most in any city in America in terms of central city. Now the only abandoned buildings left in downtown Detroit, the Ilitch Zone.
The Ilitch Zone, right.
So, one of the highlights usually of the conference is also hearing from Mayor Mike Duggan.
Yeah.
And there's also been a lot of conversation about, again, growing population, that's the drumbeat in the city, and looking towards the census. What do you think that we're going to hear from him on the island this time around, Stephen?
I expect in some ways he's going to talk a little about his future, maybe his political future.
You think so?
I think he might hint a little at what his political future might look like. I think there are some real questions about that political future, not just because of the negative stories that we've seen in the press, but also because of the potential opportunity. If Joe Biden if that campaign really takes shape, if he were to win the presidency, for instance, would Mike Duggan see an opportunity in that administration?
That's been surprising to me to hear so much speculation about Mike Duggan and what he's going to do next. He's not up for 2 years. He's only halfway through his second term. But it has surprised me the number of people who have been talking about is Mike Duggan going to run for re-election? What's he going to do next? And, I hadn't really thought about that. I figured when he didn't run for governor that this was where he was going to finish out.
The long haul.
Yeah.
I find it interesting coming up here and seeing how talking about Detroit has changed over the last 9 years that Detroit Public Television has been up here and doing this. I mean, we've gone through bankruptcy, emergency management, and kind of come out the other side. This is still a very Southeast Michigan focused, even though it is a statewide conference. We're still focusing a lot on what Southeast Michigan does, what Detroit does is very important to the rest of the state.
As it should. I mean, it is the Detroit Regional Chamber. Most of these folks are coming out of Detroit, and Detroit's still the area of greatest need, if you will, in terms of big ideas.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, so if you think back 6 years, think of the conversation that we were having about Detroit and its bankruptcy and the tension that there was in this very room around this idea of the grand bargain. We were still really unsure about how the city would get out of bankruptcy. with itself intact and with an opportunity to do some things that it hadn't been able to do before. There's 180 degrees difference in the way that people talk about the city now. It really is about how do we spread the opportunity that we're starting to see crop up in little parts of the city to everybody else. I know that's frustrating, but we have a lot of work to do to make sure that people who live in the city and have lived there a long time are benefiting from all this stuff. But back then, we weren't even talking about anybody benefiting. We were talking about whether the city would even survive.
A couple things. Education. We've talked about education up here for the last couple of years.
No, 15.
For 15.
I was moderating sessions on education 15 years ago.
But think about how many times though you have to beat the drum to say hello. I mean, are we finally at the point where you have to say there needs to be some kind of radical reform, restructuring, governance change
We've done that a bunch
to change where the trajectory of where the achievement for fourth grade learners are is has us down towards 35 in a couple more years.
I can tick off the slogans that we've top 10 and 10, over and over for 15 years.
So there's nothing different this year, or what? Or
No,
do you see anything different? Finally,
every time we discuss this, we discuss it with great passion and great determination, and there are big ideas. And we bring in Jeb. This is the second time Jeb Bush has come up here to talk to us about what he did in Florida, and we're still not doing it. And we keep talking about big ideas and strategies without addressing the structural barriers that keep us from putting in place real reform. Number one is
the structure,
the elected school board. So you have a bifurcated system in Michigan where the governor has some responsibility and the school board has some responsibility. You've got to consolidate that under an accountable governor. You also have a culture still that exists in this state, a political culture, to protect the education establishment rather than serve the children. I'll give you an example. State school board right now is sitting on $50 million that the federal government gave Michigan to replicate the best charter schools in the state, and they're not spending it because they oppose charter schools. That's not the way you implement big ideas. That's not the way other states have progressed.
So do you think that we don't have the ability to implement big ideas, or we're never going to come to a consensus on what those big ideas are that work?
Well, we're really inconsistent, I think, is the biggest problem that we have. We say we're going to do X, and we do X for a little bit, and then we get interested in Y. Or we don't ever do X, and then we say, well, now P is the answer. And we got to figure that out in addition to the structural problems that no one... They are timed.
Because we keep trying things because we try to go around barriers instead of removing the barriers, so nothing
single
works.
Authority.
So,
but the other thing is, and this is where we're going to maybe see an opportunity for some progress. If you look at the governor's budget this year, there are some significant increases for K-12 that we have not seen the likes of in 2 decades in Michigan. And if the legislature will go along with those things, and I think those are big ifs, right? The Republicans may not want to do it, but if they do, those investments actually matter. Now, it's not just money. It's never just money, but it is money. And you can't do it without money. And we are underfunding, especially K-12 in this state, in a way that is absolutely dangerous and is absolutely tied to this precipitous slide down the rankings that we have. It's not an either or, but it is a both and. You've got to fix all of this stuff, and you got to do it consistently.
Nolan.
I don't think investing more money in a broken system is going to fix the system. I think if we're going to spend that kind of additional money, we need to finally get around the obstacles to having.
You might change the governance.
I mean, our kids, there's no difference in our kids and Tennessee kids or Florida kids. Our teachers, no difference. We got committed, dedicated teachers. It's the structure that's broken.
Teachers that are burning out too at a rapid pace. All right, we got to talk about politics real quick before the conference starts up. A lot of that on the agenda, and I already talked to you. It feels like half the Michigan delegation this morning taking a look at what's happening in Washington right now. They keep saying, "But we can work together," but it's a little tenuous there, Stephen.
I think it's harder to work together in Washington right now than it probably has been in several decades. I'm going to give a lot of credit to Fred Upton and Debbie Dingell, who, they just keep at it. They keep saying, we can do this. There are opportunities to make sure that that we work together, and they don't care that the rest of the group does not want to go on.
Couple seconds before we go in.
Hey, there's a great session this morning. Catherine Gale, Michael Porter, Harvard, who say it's not the personalities, it's the process. The process is broken. We got to introduce more competition into politics.
All right, and we're going to be talking about it for the next 3 days.